Alrighty, welcome back to Between the Edits. My name is Grace, and today I have the joy of interviewing Shannon Winton. She is a developmental editor that specializes in speculative fiction, well as wearing a couple of other really awesome hats. You work with Tomeworks Editing, and you guys do lots of great kind of author education work through there. You're also a continuity editor for the Cursed Dragon Ship Publishing, and you teach some classes for the Editorial Freelance Association. So I'm really excited to dig into all of those, and I'll pass it to you, Shannon, to kind of get into some more of those details.
So Tomeworks editing it came about 3 years ago, but a lot of us who work there were collaborative editors. Actually, have been doing what's called Writers Lunch. It's an educational event every Thursday at 1 p.m. Central on Zoom, where we talk about publishing matters or we educate authors on elements of writing. And sometimes we interview insiders inside of the publishing industry. And that's been going on since before COVID. We actually ended up having to move it online. Originally, it was in person. And kind of from that, I developed the bug for teaching. And so I started working with the Editorial Freelancers Association and teaching editing, science fiction, and fantasy with them last year. And it's a 6-week course that I run twice a year. And then we're also starting another new course, which is editing mysteries, thrillers, and suspense. And that'll be starting this summer.
Amazing. So exciting. So it sounds like you kind of helped me piece the timeline together for me. So did you get into reading first, writing first, editing first? Do you do any writing? How did that journey progress for you from, start to finish, and now you're kind of doing all these awesome things to help other authors?
I think it's been about 14 years now. But I started off in writing and I was in a critique group with a bunch of people. One of them happened to be a small press publisher. And the publishing house, I think, has at least stopped temporarily because the publisher decided to change gears and go into marine biology. But that's a different story. But anyway, the publisher let me know after I had been working with them for free in the critique group, like, hey, by the way, you've been doing developmental editing for my company because I've published all these books for people who have been in this group. But that's what you actually do. You don't realize it, but your critiques hit that level, and eventually you need to get paid for that. Oh, okay. Uh, I don't know anything about running a business. I don't know anything about the industry. And I started taking classes through the Editorial Freelancers Association and to get myself, get bearing in the industry and to get a little more understanding of like what that actually meant because I like to be informed. And so that was the thing that sort of spurred me into becoming an editor. My original trade was in nursing. I think at the time I was a clinical research nurse. And it was a bit of a transition.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was different and it was kind of a shock to be like, oh, okay, this is an actual thing people do that's professional. And apparently I just have naturally come across the skill sets because a lot of my critiques at the time included like, oh, this isn't working, but this is like, these are some ways you could fix it. And then you
Uh-huh.
can fix all these other problems at the same time. And that really is like the basic bare bones of what developmental editing is. It's like, oh, this is broken in your story, or this is like maybe something that could be better.
Uh-huh.
And then, helping to develop those solutions. So that was my my origin story.
Right.
Um, and it's just kind of grown from there. But yeah, I think it's been about 14 years since then.
So you kind of started off with, like, it sounds like almost like this natural kind of inclination or understanding for developmental editing. Did that come from, or were you an avid reader for a long time before then? Or where do you think that kind of natural inclination maybe came from?
I was an escape reader as a child, and I read from
There
a,
you go.
a precocious age. My family had books everywhere. We were one of those families that had books, lining the hallways. We had a bookshelf in the bathrooms. We had books in the kitchen. Places where it didn't make sense to have books. I started off reading things in my father's library, and a lot of the stuff was mysteries and thrillers and pulps and things that he had inherited himself. So some of these things were like 30s and 50s, like golden era, but also like a lot of problematic content. Doing that though from such a young age is something that if I didn't like how the book went, I just be like, oh, I'm just going to write it in my head and I'm going to replay where I decided this stopped working for me. And I'll just like finish off in this direction. I don't wanna
Yeah.
go. And I think that's probably a lot of where it came from. And a lot of the editors I know who do really focus it on story have not like the same kind of mindset, but something very similar where they're like, oh, okay, like we have a diverging, path that we prefer to take or that we think would make the story better. And it's
Uh-huh.
just something that they naturally develop too. That was how I started getting like the proto skills of editing was just, as a reader, I was dissatisfied. So I'm just gonna essentially like fanfic in my own head.
Oh, and I love the word proto skill. I like that. But it kind of reminds me a little bit too of just a little glimpse of my own little origin story. Back in college, I wrote for a newspaper. It was like a handful of articles. It wasn't like a very robust college newspaper or anything like that. But I did articles maybe like 3 or 4 times a year or semester, depending on how busy we were. But one of the people I interviewed was another student on campus who had published her own novel, and this was probably, like, again, like, 6 or 7 years ago, and so definitely, like, indie publishing was a thing, but it's not the way that it is today. So it was kind of like a bit of a, like, "Oh my gosh, I've never met somebody who's published their own book before." And she had a very similar story of she would read all these books, avid reader, and then she would start talking to her dad, I think it was in particular, about, like, the things that she thought the book did wrong and how she would have written it differently, and then he was like, "I think you just need to write your own book then." So, yeah, it reminds me of that story, except for in your case, it was like, "I'm gonna help other people write their stories."
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Do you do any of your own, like, writing for fun as well? Is that something that you find fruitful, or are you more like, "I really like working with other people's writing"?
So, I go back and forth. I do have some stuff on Medium that I've published, and then I'm one of those unfortunate authors who likes to write the first half of books. But I will say, since I've started editing, my own writing has decreased as far as like the amount of content that I write.
Uh-huh.
So there are some things out there that are under pen names that I have, but underneath my own name, you probably won't find me except maybe for some obscure references and again clinical research papers.
Right, yeah. That's fun. So for somebody who maybe is not super familiar with developmental editing, can you kinda give us, an idea of what that is, why it's important, and how it's unique from other types of editing?
For sure. And then just to clarify, I do also provide line and copy editing at this point, but
Perfect.
developmental editing is where I like to sit. That is my bread and butter. But developmental editing is editing of the story elements themselves. And why that's important is because you can polish and polish and polish something on the line level or make sure that the grammar is pristine. But if the story isn't good, readers aren't going to engage with it. If you started the book in the wrong place, if you rush your ending, if you don't develop your character arcs, if your world building is flat, that kind of thing is covered in developmental editing. And it's essentially a critique, a positive critique most of the time, or a positive experience most of the time, where we go through the different elements that compose the story and evaluate them for your genre, for general storytelling, for audience appreciation, for like clarity, and make sure that those elements are working together so that your story conveys your themes. It conveys the emotions you want that reader to have when they get finished. And that's really what it comes down to is the impact you have on your reader and how that story like is infused to the reader. So it's usually depending on the editor, most of the time, your developmental editing will come with a couple of deliverables. There will be inline notes with like here at this specific spot, these are things that are happening. And then for me, I usually write like 15 to 20-page letters that kind of go over in a holistic way. Like this is how this particular element is impacting essentially the entire story, or this is where this element is really having an issue in these spaces over here. Or if your whole third act, for some reason isn't working, these are the ways that it aren't. And more importantly, or just as important, really, we go over ways that you, as the author, can improve that, can fix that. And even if you don't like my ideas for solutions, it's really important for you as the author to be like, okay, I now understand what isn't working at a mechanical level, and I can
Uh-huh.
figure out my own solutions. And that way you can actually make the best path. If I just go, hey, you have to do XYZ, and that's it, like that's not giving you understanding. But
Right.
if I can teach you what's happening in the story, if I can help you kind of see outside your own writing, because we get very in love with our writing. We also have a hard time as writers seeing when what we have on the page isn't matching what's in our head. So part of my job is to kind of educate you of what the audience or what your readership is actually seeing on the page, so that you can, again, go in and be like, oh, okay, I need to fix this, this, and this because it isn't matching what's in my head.
Mhm. Another question I feel like I see a lot out there in the space is when do I need beta readers and when do I need a developmental editor?
There is a lot of confusion there, and I think part of it is because the process of getting your stuff published is no longer streamlined with
Mhm.
traditional versus indie, and that's not a bad thing necessarily. Because you don't have somebody who's in the publishing industry deciding you can't publish your niche work. But because of that, people have come to different modes of getting in there, and that can get very confusing from somebody who's just starting in this industry.
Mhm.
So beta readers are usually right before you publish, and they're supposed to help you just make sure like it looks good to actual people who want to read this book, which you do want that information. You want that. Where beta readers kind of don't work is they're not generally going to give you, again, these sort of ground level fundamental solutions for when there's story problems. And that's what developmental editing does, or critique partners do, because that's also part of the early generation process. And so you want your developmental editing before any other editing. Your developmental edit should come pretty early. Most of the people that I'm getting their first draft or their skeleton draft or their discovery draft. It isn't to say that I haven't got something that somebody's been writing like for 5 or 6 years. And this is like version 25. That does happen too. But generally speaking, like you want developmental editing to happen shortly after you get your first draft, or one of your early drafts down. And sometimes you'll send it around to people. They'll be like, there's issues. I don't really know how to fix them. But this really isn't working. Your character changes too much for no clear reason. Maybe you should talk to a professional, right? And so that happens. But beta reading is usually kind of like the last step before you publish, or one of the last steps. Whereas developmental editing is very early in your
Mhm.
process.
So you also mentioned in there you've got like your first draft, right? But then you also mentioned like a skeleton draft or a discovery draft. Can you kind of break those down of basically true or false? Do I have to have a completed first draft to give to a developmental editor?
Actually, no. You can send a partial draft to an editor to kind of work through like, hey, what is actually working here? Is this worth
Mhm.
continuing or finishing? Or you're like, I've got the beginning and I have the end, and I don't know what to do with the middle. And can these two things connect? Um, some editors will call that coaching. But if you actually look at like the history of script doctoring and developmental editing, having something partial actually fits well into historical precedents for what this work is.
Awesome. Another question that I feel like I kind of see a lot on the space is, and this might be more helpful for somebody who is a developmental editor or wants to be one, kind of maybe more geared towards them. Does developmental editing change based off of the length of the story? So if you're developmental editing a short story versus a full length novel versus a novella, a series of short stories kind of thing, does the approach to developmental editing change based off of those elements?
Yes and no. So the basic thing that your developing story is the same. What you should expect from a short story is going to be very different than what you'd expect from a full novel, because the length of it means that what is included in your beginning, middle, and the end is truncated. Or if somehow you have a 4 act structure or one of the alternate structures in a short story, like the spacing of that is very different. You won't necessarily see all of the hero's journey inside of a short story that you would see inside of a full-length novel. And so we sort of expect things to happen differently, and there to be a little bit more summarization, especially if there's a lot of change in a short story. And that gets kind of into the gritty and the mechanics of it. when you're writing a series, regardless of if it's a series for multiple books or a short story series, you need to look at the arc for the series. So it's really, if you can, it's beneficial to have either a series outline with you when you take it to the dev editor, if you haven't written the books yet. But if you have written the books, to have them all edited by the same person, and discuss the fact that you want the series edited, because again, like your themes, your character changes and arcs, and even your world building have to be consistent throughout that series. So if you have more than one person looking at them, or you only have, this person over here on book two or on like the third short story, they may lack that big picture information that's necessary to give you the best advice for the entire series.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, and as somebody who's writing it, I would think that if you are envisioning this series, you would be able to come up with at least like a rough outline of kind of the trajectory of the main story, right? And then maybe some of the, the subplots and things like that might need a little bit more time, but generally speaking, having at least that general trajectory.
We're going to take a quick break from the conversation so I can tell you a little bit about a great product. You may have already heard me discuss this on the podcast, but I have what I call my legacy bookshelf. This is a special bookshelf reserved only for those books which I cherish enough to want to pass on to my children. Knowing this, a close friend of mine gifted me this custom book embosser. And here's how easy it is to use. So you can just squeeze this, and this comes right out. And then to put it back in, just clicks right back into place. And then this is a book. This is one of my favorite books. This book has an inscription to me from my grandma who gifted it to me at Christmas. And right below that is my custom seal. Now I can have a true collection of legacy books that I'll pass down to my kids, all marked with a custom seal. This is a great gift for book lovers. Use the affiliate link in the description or code BETWEEN at checkout. That's spelled BETWEEN. Using this link or that code helps support the podcast and is truly appreciated. Now back to the podcast.
I did want to answer a question that you had asked before. But so a discovery draft and a skeleton draft are things that are essentially, another term is zero draft. But discovery draft is often something that we use when we talk about writing that's done, by the seat of your pants. And so basically, it's the draft you write where you're exploring the world or the idea or the kernel of information that's in your head that isn't quite story yet. And so you're discovering as you go.
Mhm.
A zero draft is something, or a skeleton draft is something that people write often if they've already got kind of an outline, and it's not quite story yet. It is still often a lot of summary of
Mm.
events that will happen, or it's like pages of dialogue that get you from point A in your outline to point Z in your outline. And so it's not quite, an actual book with prose and dialogue and exposition in specific spots. It's more like I'm getting as much of this idea on the page
Right.
as I can so that I can come back and work on it and fix it and mold it later. But it's generally not considered a finished story. People who are new to writing end up writing these discovery drafts, or they end up writing zero drafts, and it can be disappointing when you realize, oh, I haven't actually written the book yet. I
Mhm.
have written a really extensive outline, or I have written a whole lot of the introduction and then summarize the rest, and I still need to go in there and work on it,
Mhm.
and grow it before it's like truly a manuscript.
Mhm. And on the flip side of that, that might be encouraging for somebody if they're like looking at their draft and they realize that it's not what they want it to be, but then there's a name for that and they know who they can go to now to help for it. Like that could also be very encouraging perspective too. As a in your experience, is it easier to kind of work on some of those drafts? Is it more difficult, do you find? Or is it just like they're two different beasts and you got to have different mentalities to tackle them?
I think you have to have different mentalities, because if you are judging a discovery draft based upon a finished draft, you're going to end up focusing on things that the author prospectively is going to fix anyway, know they need to fix. Especially since I work in science fiction and fantasy, your discovery draft, in those genres may not have the world building set up in a way you would expect in a final story. So, I don't want to spend my precious space giving feedback, harping on exposition in a discovery draft when I actually expect, just because I've been through these a lot. I expect the exposition to be a bit wonky, and I expect there to be a whole lot of tell and world building in the discovery draft because otherwise, how are they going to get on the page? A lot of times, good exposition and world building is either short or it's relevant to the action at hand. In a discovery draft, you don't have the nuance yet on the page to make sure that those things are like done by including or that they're part of the prose or that the dialogue partially acts as exposition without becoming data dumps.
Mhm.
And so if you know I spend 3/4 of my time complaining about how your exposition feels instead of being like, hey, I think you know this already, this is some information on how to fix the exposition, the author's not going to get as much out of it because, again, you know, this is not a finished draft that they would expect to hand a reader.
Mhm.
And I've already told them something that they know, or something that because they're going to go through and do a whole bunch of line level work later, they would have fixed anyway.
Gotcha.
So if you're an editor, be very careful about that, and also figure out what your client is actually handing you so that you don't prioritize the wrong aspect of the storytelling when what they really need is to know if the character art is going to work in general or the shape of their story is working.
Right. I comes down a little bit to defined expectations as well. So that's why it's important to before you even start reading the work and everything like that, meeting with the client and being like, "Okay, here's what you originally came to me with. Like this is what this means. Are these deliverables that you are excited by? Is this what you're looking for?" Basically having that conversation before you even get to the point because for the client, for the author, it would be frustrating, like you're talking about, to get all that work back and be like, okay, these are things I already knew that I needed and that I was going to work on. And then also for you, like that's you spend all that time putting together a very nice, letter and all those inline comments to work on these elements, but it's not what the author was looking for. So having those discussions ahead of time and having clear set expectations, I think helps a lot with that as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I do like to do is like kind of a face-to-face consultation before I get started with an author. If I'm working with an indie press or a medium or small press, that's not normally how it goes. But if I'm working with an
Mhm.
indie author who's making the decision themselves, I like to get a face-to-face. I like to ask you like, hey, what are you looking for? Or hey, do you have concerns yourself that you would like me to focus on? Because I mean, sometimes you're creating in a vacuum, but the process of creation itself does not have to be lonely, and you can ask questions like, hey, I know that I am gambling on this particular plot twist. Does it work? And you're allowed to ask questions. So normally I like to kind of sit for about 30 minutes with the author and like discuss their book, what they love about it, and what they're doing with it as far as like what their goals are and what they think their themes are and that kind of thing. Because there will be times where something seems like, hey, this doesn't seem like it's working for the story. Maybe you shouldn't, have this. Maybe you should replace it with this. And it turns out that that thing is what they love about it.
Right.
And they're really going to have to sit down and like decide, okay, is this actually belong in another story? And sometimes that is the case. But sometimes if I'm saying, hey, the romance isn't working, maybe we should talk about removing the romance. They're like, but I'm writing a romantic novel.
Right.
Then my advice, if I'm really trying to fit into the goals of that author, that indie author, for the genre that they're working in, or if they're trying to write to market, then my goals need to be very different than they would be if I'm just evaluating story as story. And that's I don't know if that's something we want to go too deep into, but writing to market, like editing for a specific genre and hitting expectations for genre, it can be very important. If I don't know that's what you're trying to do, if
Right.
you're trying to write to a specific subgenre or niche, then my edit may look very different. So doing a pre-interview, I think, is really beneficial for both me as an editor and also for the author. Some editors do have questionnaires where they get that same kind of information,
Mhm.
and then one of the other things that I like to do is a sort of exit consultation, and that's usually an hour, sometimes longer, where we discuss the feedback and we discuss ideas that the author has to make updates to see like, hey, let's spitball, let's see if this is going to work, and then also if there's any sort of confusion. Because sometimes we think we're being very clear, even as editors, and the author is like, "Wait, did you mean this? Did you mean that?" And so, just going through the letter or going through the feedback or going through the new creative process can be really beneficial to the author too. Not every editor does that. And if that sounds like something that is terrifying as an author, not every author wants to engage with that. but it's something that I like to at least offer. And that I include as part of my edit just because I think it is so beneficial, especially to newer authors, to indie authors. Again, if you're working with a press, your press probably has a way that they want your editor to communicate with you, vice versa. And they kind of call a lot of the shots. So that may be very different if you're like, oh, this isn't what I did when I published through such and such, publishing company.
Mhm.
So
Right. Okay, so that now I've got 3 different questions for you, so we'll take it one at a time. But, first I want to start with, in your experience, what are the kind of some of the more common, things that you find in stories that kind of continually pop up of, like, similar elements that authors maybe struggle with?
so one of the things that I see a lot, especially in science fiction and fantasy, is inconsistent world building. And
Uh-huh.
so if I am looking at something that is supposed to be, a finished draft, not my early stuff, going through and finding the logistical issues. For instance, one of the things that I see a whole lot is travel times change throughout a story. So,
Mhm.
in the process of going on this journey, it's long and arduous and takes, three-quarters of the book. Returning to where you came from all of a sudden only takes like an hour and a half.
Right.
And so from like a logistical standpoint, the lead up to the big battle and or the return home, and just the movement across the map often changes. You're still on foot or you're still on horseback, but you are just flying down the road at the end. But that is so common. And once you start editing, if you're a new editor, you're gonna have a hard time reading books because you're like, "Oh, no," like, these books where there's a journey, because 'cause you're like, "I see it, like, I can't not see it now," especially in published books. So that is extremely common, again, especially in science fiction, fantasy, and adventure. But, other things too that I think people have a hard time with, is the motivation for both their secondary cast and their antagonistic cast, because they know what they need their main character to do to grow, or they have that kind of already in their head, or they have it down, pat. But why the friends help or why the friends abandon them at certain points doesn't always make sense. It'll come across as plot convenient. Same thing with the antagonist. When you think about like why would the antagonist decide to reveal their whole plan now? What's driving them, or why would they attack at this particular point when the main character is finally ready instead of attacking earlier,
Right.
or that kind of thing where their actions become kind of plot convenient.
Mhm.
Being able to build in these other characters' motivations on the page when your focus is on this protagonist over here, that can be difficult. And that that's really one of those places where an editor can help you. Because you're like, I need it and I can't see a way around it. What do I do? And so that's one of the things that a good edit can help you with is figuring out those issues with motivation, with those issues with either flat,
Mhm.
or basic characters, or if you hit on some tropes characters or stereotypes, having a good editor will help you still get them to do what you need them to do for the story without them coming across again as offensive.
Yeah, or like token, like somebody
Or
that was thrown
token.
in there
Yeah.
for a specific reason, but doesn't really feel like they have any, like, real impact or consequence.
Yeah.
Right. So then that kind of, ties into the next question as far as, like, things again that you've seen in actually working with authors, but then also doing your work with Tomeworks and, like, the educational aspect. What is something that you've seen consistently be, like, a big level up for, authors when it comes to kinda like this developmental editing stage of the writing and everything? Like, what's been the biggest helpful practical tool for people?
I think doing writing exercises and getting immediate feedback is something that is really helpful, and that kind of goes outside of just developmental editing. That's just as a writer in general. Most people don't want to be like, oh, I take writing classes like I took language arts, whatever, in high school. But doing writing practice and being able to take the ideas that compose story and actually apply them on the page and grow your line level abilities,
Mhm.
or the actual craft of writing abilities so that you can merge the developmental feedback you're getting or even apply the ideas you have for your story onto the page, for lack of a better way to put it, just because we're off the cuff with pizzazz,
Right.
but really actually like with cohesion,
Mhm.
and with style, I think is a big level up because there's it's one thing to have the idea of a story, and it's another thing to actually tell that story in a remarkable way. And so a lot of people can create the basics of a story, but to actually write a good story, like, yeah, that's your level up.
Mhm. I love that. And then one of the things that you commonly hear is like you need to read good work in order to be able to write good work. But I think like what you're getting at here is maybe just a little bit more practical than that because like okay, read a good book. I think most people are reading good books, you know, but then being able to take that experience like that kind of helps inform your approach to things. But having those concrete, like you said, writing exercises, I think is just with that, kind of immediate or close to feedback I think is a lot more specific of like, okay, you read this and I can see how you're putting it into the work here. Like I can see the elements that you have learned from that, but actually executing it can be a whole nother step. And so I really love the conjunction of those two with the emphasis on like getting that feedback with those writing exercises, I think is amazing.
One of the things that I think people underappreciate is fan fiction. Um, because that is writing exercises, right? You're writing in somebody else's
Absolutely.
universe. You already have this cast of characters, and they all come with their own, histories and their own personalities. And you already have a world built. And then, if you're writing fan fiction, you're either, changing only some of the elements of that, or you're putting these characters in the world and then the situation they're in. Instead of fighting bad guys, they're gonna go get a milk and eggs at the store. But you're but you're not having to do as much of the creative work, as far as, like, the actual genesis of that
Mhm.
original story, so much as you're taking those elements and you're putting them into a new story that's your own. And so being a fan fiction, writer and writing, like, short stories about, Battlestar Galactica or even something, like, super niche, like, Rainbow Bright, something from, like, way back in the '80s. Doing that can be really beneficial, especially if you're new, because again, like, you don't have to worry about the creation of those story elements. You just have to apply them in new and novel ways. And if there is a fandom out there, you'll get feedback.
Right. I was gonna say, I was like and they have a dedicated fan base, so you just have to find them on the internet, and they're gonna love reading it, and they will be honest with you about if they feel like you did justice to, whatever it is, but it's the sphere of fan fiction is like I think a lot of people in this space have some sort of experience in it because it is just so enticing, and, it's a way to relate to people and to share in a work that we all kind of love and all that kind of stuff, but I mean, I made a new friend over my Christmas holiday, and we were talking about books and everything like that, and, the topic of fan fiction came up, and she was like, "Did you write any fan fiction?" And I was like, "I may have had an account on Wattpad," like, and, but at the time, it was like One Direction or something, so,
There's
but
a lot of
yeah,
One Direction and Harry Styles. Like that is, I mean, there have been actual books published where most of the original content was stripped, but they've evolved into like things that have become bestsellers
actual
that are like
published
Harry
works,
Styles
yeah.
fanfiction.
Yeah, and movies and, like so, I mean, like, it's where we are right now, and so, I don't know, like, obviously, I think there's sometimes that fan fiction gets taken too far, everything like that, but as far as, like, you're talking about, like, the exercise of practicing your writing with a world that already exists, you don't have to come up with the rules, you just have to, take something you already love and put your own spin on it, like, I think that's a really great way to flex those muscles, you know?
Right, and one of the things most of us, probably aren't coming to this podcast because we have an MFA. But if you do decide to go get an MFA, one of the things you'll realize is that like the writing advice that I'm giving you to go make fan fiction isn't something that I've created or isn't something that is even new. One of the ways that people used to or that they use, excuse me, to learn how to write is they'll say emulate this other author, see if you can do their voice. That's the same thing.
In college, I took a class on, I was originally supposed to get a, minor in journalism, and that did not pan out. I actually kinda similar to you, my degree has nothing to do with what I'm doing now. I have a degree in cell and molecular biology, and I wanted to be a science journalist, so I was gonna get a minor in journalism, and then that didn't work out or whatever. But in pursuing that minor originally, I did end up taking this literature course that was all about, like, classic horror genre, which is not my like normal, right? I'm
Mm.
like, I don't like horror movies or anything like that. I'm because I assumed that the two were similar, I never read anything from the horror genre. But I actually really loved this class, and I remember that was a couple of things that we did in that class is we had they were more of essays, it wasn't creative writing, but we got to compare writing styles and, like, look at the things that people use in order to, exact certain outcomes and, like, kind of breaking down those elements, and I was like, you get to feel, a style for the author and the way that they do those things, and it's like, okay, by analyzing their writing and then trying to emulate it, like, you learn about different techniques that people use that have been very successful.
Yeah, the marriage of, like, mood and tone on the page for horror with plot progression, that's something to be studied. It really is, because if an author can do that well and suspense, I mean, horror and suspense are essentially on the same, line.
Mhm.
And so I'm glad you got to do that because not only is that a lot of fun, but I'm sure that leveled up your writing as well.
Yeah, well, and again, this is also just I've only done, like, a couple of writing contests because I do love to write, like, in my own time, more hobbyish, but, I do love to write. The only times I've ever entered into writing contests, I have always somehow end up writing, like, a horror mystery piece, and, like, I've won, like, only in that genre, and it's, like, not my go-to at all, but yeah, I don't know. So that's fun. So then the next thing that the last question I kind of had in regards to that editing aspect, when I mentioned the three questions, the last one is you mentioned it a couple of times about wanting to be very clear with your feedback to the author, having it be a positive critique experience, things like that. A little peek behind the curtain is I send out like a pre-show kind of form for you guys to fill out some questions for me. And one of the things you mentioned wanting to discuss was learning to take criticism in this process, and I think that's huge. It's, especially with indie authors who are not going through the traditional publishing route and the system looks entirely different and you feel like you're out there on your own and then getting feedback from various people. I think that can be really difficult. So I would love to just touch on that topic with you.
Yeah, I mean, and that's something that it is hard for people, in the real world to do. We we don't really live in a society where criticism is given in a positive way. Most of the time, if you're receiving criticism, it's telling you that you have failed, right?
Mhm.
It's not in a collaborative and ongoing process. And criticism, when you're receiving it, it should be collaborative. It should be ongoing. It should be because you're developing this project together. And I know that sounds kind of businessy and hokey, but I mean, your book is a project. We're all working on it to develop a final polished manuscript that
Mhm.
you will then publish. And so when authors finish a draft, especially if they're new, they're like, okay, it's done. And their mindset is it's done, grade me. And that is not how this process should go, even though that's what you've sort of been like raised to feel about criticism or even about criticism in writing. Because I mean, again, like, you get a grade in English class, or maybe they they gave you like a first draft and then a final draft, and so each of these things is actually a separate project. But it isn't. It's a collaborative process. This is like you saying, "Hey, this is my cake, and what you've given me is the ingredients." And I'm not grading you on the cake. I'm saying, "Hey, these are the ingredients. You forgot butter. It's cool. Let's just go get some butter." Um, but if you're saying, if you're coming to this process with these predetermined, views of what criticism is or what your story is, then it's going to be disappointing. And I don't want that for you. Like the point of getting feedback isn't for me. At least this is my mentality. I know historically the way people give feedback is the editor or the instructor or teacher is on high and you are the lowly peon and they just rake your story over the coals. That is not helpful. That's just not that's just not helpful. Being able to like let somebody demean you or to rip your book apart. I mean, yeah, some people come out stronger than that, but most people don't, and it's demoralizing and it's unnecessary. It's a narcissistic edifice from a bygone era, in my opinion.
Mhm.
What we're doing, if you come to an editor, at least a modern editor, is we are collaborating. Yeah, I may tell you that like maybe cumin doesn't belong in this cake. Maybe let's find another, spice to put in here and let's spitball what else you might be able to put in. Because I just don't think that earthy tone is going to work. Cool beans. But it it doesn't have to be, painful,
Mhm.
because we're not done, right? Like, this is a process. We're not done. I'm here to help you in the process. So when we're coming together to work on something, hopefully other editors out there feel the same way. Like, I'm not here to beat you down or to
Mhm.
make you feel bad about your book. I'm here to help you make the book better. And that's it. And sometimes the things that we have to do to make the book better don't feel great.
Mhm.
But the goal is to empower you to make that book better. It is not to tell you, you made all these mistakes, or there's no point in writing a book, or uh, why bother? Like, that does not need to be in our critique process at all.
Mhm.
The last thing I want to do is demoralize an author, or especially a new author, and have them put that book in a drawer and never come back to it.
Right.
Um,
Well, and to
that's
borrow
not good for
your
me. That's not good for you.
right, and to borrow your analogy there of, like, cumin in the cake, it's like, maybe like, "I have a question about the cumin that's in this cake," right? And then you can talk to the author and, like, "How important is it to you that there is cumin in this cake?" "Oh, you wanted it to be a cumin cake." "Okay, then maybe we need to change these elements to help make the cumin make more sense," you know? So it's some of that too. It's like the goal of the editor should be to, be an objective reader, right? That's a very important part of it, but also to help exact the author's vision. So there's a little bit of that in there too of let's see what we can do with the cumin.
Yeah, I mean, if the whole goal was to experiment with cumin, absolutely, let's sit down and experiment. And that's one of those reasons why it's so good to have that sort of consultation ahead of time, because like if I'm giving you feedback that the cumin needs to go, but you're like, no, this is the experiment. Well, I've messed that up. But yeah, I mean, it's really important too, though, that you as an author uh, spread your wings a little bit and get feedback from other people. It's hard not to go to friends and family first, but friends and family tend to be bad because they're trying to be nice.
Yeah.
And so they
Mhm.
may give you feedback that's like, "Oh, I loved it. It was so beautiful, and I thought that the names were great." And they're they're gonna give you the nicest version most of the time. But that doesn't help you grow as far as being able to let somebody else work in your imagination space, and tell you things that are and are not working in a way that helps you develop them out. If you're fully unaccustomed to getting feedback without it becoming personal feeling, then it's going to be a lot harder to take your
Mhm.
critique from a professional. The professional should not demean you. The professional should not say things like, I don't understand why you did this, right? Like, they should not equate your book with you. And it's hard for people who wrote the book to not do that anyway, because that's your book baby.
Yeah.
That is something that it is a labor of love. It is part of you. But your manuscript isn't you. And so if you are going down this path of becoming an author, um, slowly learning how to divorce yourself from the story is important, or becoming self-aware when you are writing something that you're like, I can't emotionally be separated from this. I might need a few weeks before I get feedback on it.
Right.
Those are
Absolutely.
important, elements of yourself to know about, so that you can temper when and how you get feedback.
Amazing. Okay, so we'll go ahead and wrap up with the last two questions. And so another little peek behind the curtains. Normally, one of the questions I like to ask people is, how has being, in your case, an editor, right, or whatever you do in the book world. So, like I said, an educator, editor for you, changed your perspective on life. But I was doing a little research recently. I looked on your LinkedIn post, and I noticed you had a post like a while back ago or something like that about how you loved flipping that kind of mentality of like, okay, how has things in your life affected how you have become as an editor, or like just kind of turning that on its head. So I'll give you the option if you want to answer one way or the other.
Remember that particular post, but that's fine. I write a lot of random stuff in places. But I honestly, I feel like being a nurse really impacted how I edit.
Mm,
Because I come from a background of emergency medicine, of working in trauma ICU, and there are so many big emotions that come from knowing somebody on the worst day of their life.
mm,
And that's, for me, for their family, for the patient, even for physicians, the people who are there, it's hard no matter who you are in that process. And so knowing how to meet people where they are is something that I developed as a student nurse. I worked in the ER as a student nurse. And so I think that has informed a lot of how I approach my editing because I can't necessarily communicate with one author the way that I would communicate with another author. Another thing it kind of helped me do is recognize like the psychology. Because if you are a family member who is coming into the ER because somebody you love was hurt, and I'm trying to give you instructions for how to take care of them, your brain isn't working the way it would be on a regular day. It's working in fight or flight. And if I'm giving you a whole bunch of instructions while your brain is in fight or flight, those will not stick in your head. And so the way I like to give instructions in my feedback is definitely impacted by that early nursing stuff because like I recognize the first time that you read my letter, you're not going to have your normal rational self. Like this is fight or flight for a lot of authors, even if it's at a much lower level. And so the way that I communicate in my letters and how I become very precise in explaining why we are learning about this thing or why we're talking about this thing before I go into it, is because, most of the time, the first read through, the author is going to pick up maybe one out of every three words. And so I want to make sure that they recognize like both the positives, but also the why, because otherwise emotionally they may spiral or they may not be able to wrap their head around what's going on. Um, and so like giving instructions, giving information, giving feedback and all of that stuff was heavily influenced by the tactics that I had to learn in those situations. Even though the worlds are extremely different. I never want somebody to come away from an interaction with me being like, I don't know what just happened and I don't know what to do now.
Right.
Doesn't matter which world we're in. Um, and I think that really has informed who I am as an editor.
It was kind of a question that I had on my list that I wanted to ask you, but you kind of already talked about it, which is like the things that you should look for in editors of maybe things that would be a bad sign if an editor did. And so you've kind of mentioned a couple times here of an editor should not make you feel like you are the manuscript, right? Like, and they should be able to give you that constructive feedback in a way that feels motivating and informative, right? And focusing on those two aspects, because then at that point, like, I think it's inevitable for somebody to be disappointed or feel dejected or sad or like a failure, if something they worked so hard for comes back and they need to do some work on it. I think that's always going to be part of the equation. But if somebody leaves that conversation being like, okay, I'm a little bummed that, I had to do this and this and this for my work and yada yada, but the editor gave me some ideas that I can play with and I kind of like some of them and like that would be a cool direction for the story and she seemed really helpful and so there's a way that you can kind of shore someone up in the process of like even though you're telling them something that may make them sad and that's okay, you're doing it in a way that makes them feel hopeful about the new outcome of whatever could be.
Yeah, and providing a path forward, I think, is really important. There's a lot of reasons why your executive function just short circuits, and so and so if feedback that I'm giving or the feedback that editor is giving doesn't provide with next steps or ways of starting the process of revisions, it can be really hard for an author to do that on their own. I think it's really important for editors to make sure that they've provided that, or provided the scale or scope of the problems that they've touched upon from the manuscript, so that the author actually can wrap their head around the feedback, understand what they need to
Mhm.
do, and then actually go forth and execute that. So,
Amazing. Yeah, I love that. So that's a perfect note to wrap up the editing portion on here. The last question I have for you is the standard question. 2 to 3 book recommendations for our listeners, if you got them.
okay. So I'm gonna go with ones that I've recently read. I am bad at last names though, but I really I really enjoy cozies. I think cozies are a really fun genre, and I don't mean cozy mysteries, although I do love those too. But like cozy fantasy, cozy sci-fi are things that are kind of growing, and I love them to death. So Monsters and Mainframes by Barbara Truelove is one that I read from 2025. That one is a lot of fun. Sarcastic AIs and old world monsters and cryptids in space and Dracula's in the mix. But I also really enjoy Someone You Can Build Your Nest In. I would actually suggest listening to that one because the narrator has just such a gorgeous voice. And that one is written by John Whistle. It was his debut book, I think in 2023. I do, have a whole bunch of other things that I love, but if you're looking for something new, those are good. Those are some beautiful cozies to start off with.
Amazing. Awesome. They sound so fun. But this has been an absolute joy. I think I learned a lot from it. It was really great talking to you. I think people who are listening to this, both people who are, editors or interested in editing, but then also the authors and the people who just love books, I think everyone had a really great takeaway from this conversation. So I'm really excited to share it with everybody. I want to make sure that people can get connected with you if they have any questions after listening to this or they want to reach out to you for work or editing. So what is your social media and where can people find you?
So I am Shannon the editor in a couple of places. I am not good at social media. But if you want to come find me as an editor, you can find me at www.tomeworksedits.com. And then again, on social media, I am Shannon, the editor. I think on Facebook, I think that might be my LinkedIn handle as well. But if you look up Shannon Winton editor, you can probably find me in a couple of places. I run Writer's Lunch, and you can find that at youtube.com/Tomeworks edits as well. And if you're looking to just get in touch to become a client, tomeworksedits.com, you can fill out a general questionnaire if you don't know, what you want yet. And we'll contact you and set up that consultation call, and we'll get started.
Perfect. And we'll make sure that I have everything in the show notes and the description on the various platforms. But again, thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Grace, for the opportunity.